In the summer of 1720, a pirate captain named Charles Vane found himself in a situation that no amount of skill, bravery, or cunning could solve. Vane was good. By any reasonable measure, he was excellent. He had terrorized the Caribbean for years. He had escaped traps that killed other men. He had outrun frigates, outwitted governors, and survived things that should have killed him a dozen times over. He was, by the standards of the golden age of piracy, a professional. And then, one morning he saw it. Not a frigate, not a patrol sloop, not anything he had a plan for. A first-rate ship of the line, 110 cannons, 800 trained men, walls of English oak nearly 3 feet thick. A vessel that had cost more to build than the entire annual economy of most Caribbean colonies. Vane looked at it. He looked at his own ship. He made the only calculation that made any sense. He ran. Not because he was a coward. Charles Vane was many things, violent, ruthless, ambitious, but a coward was not among them. He ran because he understood something that Hollywood has spent 200 years trying to make you forget. In the real golden age of piracy, the pirates were not the most powerful things on the ocean. They were prey. Today on Rogue Bilge, we are going inside the ship that the pirates feared more than any other. The vessel that the Royal Navy built not just to fight pirates, but to make piracy itself an act of suicide. The man of war. We are going to look at what it was made of, how it worked, what it cost, and what it did to the men who thought they could stand against it. We are going to look at the specific battles, the specific moments, where the greatest pirates of the Golden Age came face to face with this machine and discovered exactly what they were worth against 3 feet of seasoned English oak. And we are going to ask the question that historians have been arguing about for 3 centuries. Was there any version of the Golden Age that could have lasted? Or was the man of war always going to win? Weigh anchor, we are going in. Before you can understand what the man of war did to the Golden Age of piracy, you have to understand what the man of war actually was. Because the name does not prepare you for the reality. A first-rate ship of the line, the highest classification in the Royal Navy's rating system, was not just a large warship. It was a category of object that had no real equivalent in the civilian world of the early 18th century. Think of it this way. In 1710, the largest building most people in England had ever seen was a cathedral. The largest complex machine they had ever encountered was a mill or a large clock mechanism. The largest vehicle they had ever ridden was a horse-drawn carriage. Then imagine encountering the HMS Victory, 2,162 tons of displacement, 69 meters from bow to stern, 57 meters from keel to the top of the mainmast, 5 gun decks, 104 cannons in the final configuration, a crew of 850 men, a population larger than most English villages of the era. To build a ship like this required an almost incomprehensible amount of material and labor. The Victory alone required the timber from approximately 6,000 mature oak trees. Those trees had to be selected, felled, transported, seasoned, a process that took years, and then shaped by shipwrights into the specific curved and angled components that made up a ship's hull. Seasoning the timber was critical. Green oak, freshly cut, would warp and crack as it dried. A ship built from unseasoned wood was a ship that would develop fatal leaks within years. The Royal Navy maintained vast timber stocks, yards full of oak in various stages of drying, because you could not build a first-rate warship in a hurry. The materials alone took decades to prepare. The finished hull was roughly 90 centimeters thick at its widest point below the waterline. The outer clanking was fastened to the frames with copper and iron bolts driven through wood so dense and compressed that a standard pirate cannonball, fired from the kind of light 4-pound gun that most pirate ships carried, would often fail to penetrate it. This is not mythology. This is documented. Colonial records from the Caribbean include multiple accounts of pirate vessels firing on naval warships and watching their cannonballs either ricochet from the hull entirely or bury themselves in the wood without causing structural damage. The physics were simply not in the pirates' favor. But the hull was only the beginning. The armament of a first-rate ship of the line was designed around the concept of the broadside, the simultaneous firing of every cannon on one side of the ship. A full broadside from the HMS Victory delivered approximately 500 kilograms of iron in a single simultaneous volley, half a metric ton, in 1 second. To put that in perspective, the typical pirate ship of the Golden Age carried between 8 and 14 cannons, usually 4-pounders or 6-pounders, the light, fast guns suited to quick boarding actions against unarmed merchants. A full broadside from such a ship delivered perhaps 30 kilograms of iron. A man-of-war's broadside against a pirate sloop was not a battle, it was a demolition. The crew completed the picture. 800 trained sailors and marines, organized into a hierarchy of specializations that had been refined over centuries. Gun crews who could load and fire a heavy cannon every 90 seconds. Marines trained in volley fire who could clear a deck of men in seconds. Officers who had spent their careers studying naval tactics and who communicated through a flag signal system sophisticated enough to coordinate the movements of entire fleets. Every man had a role. Every role had been drilled into him through years of continuous service. The Royal Navy of 1720 was, in military terms, the most professional fighting force that had ever been put on the water. And the pirates? The pirates were, by design, a collection of talented individuals who had rejected the kind of institutional discipline that produces that level of professional coordination. Their strength was flexibility, speed, and the element of surprise. Against a merchant ship unprepared for combat, those qualities were decisive. Against a man-of-war whose crew had been drilling for battle since the age of 14, those qualities were irrelevant. Hollywood has been lying to you about naval combat for your entire life, and the lie is not a small one. It is not a matter of minor inaccuracies or compressed timelines. It is a fundamental structural misrepresentation of what a sea battle between a pirate ship and a warship actually looked like. In every pirate movie, the scrappy underdog gets close to the big ship, fires a few clever shots, hooks on with grappling irons, and wins the day through superior cunning and dramatic music. The audience cheers, the credits roll, and an entire generation grows up believing that a determined enough pirate could take on anything. Here is what the actual historical record shows. In documented encounters between pirate vessels and purpose-built naval warships during the Golden Age of piracy, from roughly 1700 to 1730, the outcome was not close. The naval vessel won, almost every time, and it usually was not a battle. It was a pursuit. The pirates knew this. They knew it better than anyone, because unlike the movie makers, they had actually seen what happens when a pirate ship takes a full broadside from a man-of-war at close range. The answer is, not much of the ship remains. A single heavy cannonball, the kind fired from a 32-pounder, which was standard on the lower gun decks of a first-rate, transferred enough kinetic energy on impact to shatter a wooden ship's hull from the inside. The ball would enter through the outer planking, fragment the wood into high-velocity splinters, splinters that killed more men than the ball itself, and exit through the inner planking, potentially killing or wounding every man standing in its path. A broadside was not one ball, it was 50. 50 simultaneously, hitting the same 100-meter stretch of ship at the same moment. This is why the pirates ran, not because they lacked courage. Some of the most physically brave men of the 18th century were Golden Age pirates, men who boarded moving ships under fire, who fought hand-to-hand against armed crews, who faced hanging rather than surrender. They did not lack courage. They lacked the delusion that courage was sufficient. They were practical men, and practically speaking, fighting a man-of-war in open water was not a military decision. It was a form of death by choice. So the pirates adapted, and their adaptation tells you something important about how the Golden Age of piracy actually worked, and why it lasted as long as it did before the Navy finally crushed it. The pirates did not fight the man-of-war. They avoided it, completely, deliberately, systematically. They hunted merchant ships, unarmed or lightly armed vessels carrying cargo, not warships. They used shallow water coastal regions where large naval vessels could not safely navigate. They maintained intelligence networks in port cities that warned them when naval patrols were arriving, and they moved constantly, never anchoring in the same location long enough for the Navy to organize a response. It was not bravery versus firepower. It was a chess match between two very different military doctrines. The Navy had power, the pirates had mobility. For roughly 30 years, mobility was enough. Before we get into the specific moments, the actual battles where the man-of-war finally caught up with the legends, I want to say something directly to you. You are watching Rogue Bilge because you want the real history, not the sanitized version. The version where the facts are uncomfortable, and the numbers are honest, and the heroes are complicated, and the endings are not always satisfying. If that is why you are here, and I think it is, then hit the subscribe button and ring the bell, because this is the kind of channel that only works if people who want real history can find it, and the algorithm helps us when you engage. Now let's talk about the battles. Let's talk about what actually happened when the Navy stopped just patrolling and started actively hunting. Let's talk about the end of the Golden Age, ship by ship, captain by captain. In 1718, the British government made a decision that the pirates had been hoping they would never make. They got serious. Not just patrol the trade routes serious, not just offer pardons and hope for the best serious. Allocate ships and resources and officers whose careers depend on results serious. Send Woodes Rogers to Nassau serious. Woodes Rogers arrived in Nassau Harbor in 1718 with a Royal Navy escort, a government commission, and a pardon for any pirate who wanted one, and a guaranteed noose for any who did not. Within weeks, he had executed 8 pirates, rebuilt the Nassau fort, and dismantled the Republic of Pirates that Hortigold and Blackbeard had built. Nassau, the home port of the Golden Age, the city outside the law, the place where the pirate world had its beating heart, was gone, and Rogers was just the beginning. What followed was the most systematic naval campaign against piracy that the world had seen up to that point. The Admiralty assigned dedicated anti-piracy patrol vessels to the Caribbean. They built intelligence networks in colonial ports. They offered rewards. They pressured colonial governors to stop the quiet toleration of pirate economics that had allowed Nassau to function for a decade. One by one, the legends ran out of ocean. Edward Thatch, Blackbeard, died in Ocracoke Inlet, North Carolina on November 22, 1718. And the manner of his death tells you something important about the way the Navy had adapted its tactics. Blackbeard had not been caught by a first-rate ship of the line. He was not destroyed by a broadside from a 100-gun warship. He was caught by Lieutenant Robert Maynard commanding 2 small sloops. Shallow draft vessels specifically chosen because they could follow Blackbeard into the inshore waters where large naval vessels could not go. The Navy had learned from the chess match. If the pirates used shallow water as their protection, the Navy would send shallow draft ships. If the pirates relied on speed, the Navy would use intelligence to find them before they could run. If the pirates fought through fear and reputation, the Navy would send men who were not afraid. Maynard lost over a third of his men in the Ocracoke engagement. The fighting was brutal and close and extremely costly to the naval side. Blackbeard himself took 5 musket balls and 20 sword cuts before he died. Not every pirate end required a man of war. The man of war was the strategic context, the pressure that forced the pirates out of the deep water lanes, into the shallows, into the positions where smaller naval vessels could reach them. The man of war did not always deliver the killing blow, but it set the conditions in which the killing blow became possible. Bartholomew Roberts was, by any reasonable historical measure, the most successful pirate of the Golden Age. Over 400 ships captured between 1719 and 1722. Operations spanning the Caribbean, the West African coast, the waters off Brazil and Newfoundland. A code of governance so sophisticated that it became the template for other pirate crews across the Atlantic. He was brilliant. He was organized. He was, in naval terms, genuinely dangerous. And on February 10, 1722, off the coast of Cape Lopez on the West African coast, he encountered HMS Swallow. The engagement was brief. Roberts's crew had been celebrating the capture of a prize vessel the night before. When the Swallow appeared at dawn, many of Roberts's men were drunk. Some were still asleep. Roberts himself was on deck when the Swallow opened fire. A grapeshot volley, dozens of small iron balls fired simultaneously from the Swallow's forward guns, swept the deck of the Royal Fortune, Roberts's flagship. Roberts was hit in the throat. He was dead before he fell. Without their captain, without the man who had held 400 ships worth of experience and intelligence together, through sheer force of will and the most meticulously enforced code of any pirate of the era, Roberts's crew collapsed. Some fought on for hours, in tribute to the man who had given them something worth fighting for. Most surrendered when they understood that the fight was hopeless. Of the 272 men captured that day, 52 were executed. 70 more died of wounds or disease before their trials concluded. The most successful pirate in history had been killed by a 50-gun warship's opening volley. The engagement had lasted less than 30 minutes, not the dramatic single combat of the movie version. The systematic, professional, impersonal elimination of a way of life. Every pirate captain who died or was captured after 1718 was a casualty not just of the specific ship or officer that caught them, but of the strategic decision the British government had made to deploy overwhelming naval force as policy. The man-of-war was the instrument of that policy, the physical expression of a government that had decided it was done tolerating the Caribbean as a space outside its control. The man-of-war did not only hunt pirates in open water, it blockaded them. A pirate economy depended on two things: the ability to sell stolen goods and the ability to recruit new crew members. Both required access to ports, and ports could be blockaded. When the Royal Navy stationed warships at the entrances to Nassau, Tortuga, and the other Caribbean ports that had served as pirate bases, the effect on piracy was immediate and severe. Pirates who could not sell their prizes could not fund operations. Pirates who could not recruit could not replace the men they lost to combat and disease. The economic infrastructure of the Golden Age was built on access to these ports, and the man-of-war controlled that access. The blockade was not a glamorous tactic. It did not produce famous battles or legendary single combats. It did not make for good movie scenes, but it was probably the single most effective anti-piracy tool the Navy deployed, more effective than any individual engagement. Blackbeard understood this better than anyone. His famous blockade of Charleston Harbor in 1718 was a direct response to the Navy's port denial strategy. He was demonstrating that the pirates could use the same tactic, could threaten the colonial economy in ways that would force negotiations. It was brilliant, it was audacious, and it was also the moment that confirmed to the British government that Blackbeard had to die. The Charleston blockade lasted 4 days. The Admiralty's response lasted years. To understand why the man-of-war was so effective against the pirates, you have to go inside it. Not the trophy parts, the upper deck, the captain's cabin, the dramatic views from the quarterdeck. The parts that made the ship function as a weapons system rather than just a large boat. Start with the lower gun deck. On a first rate, the lower gun deck was home to the heaviest ordnance, typically 32-pounder long guns, the most powerful cannon type in common naval use during the early 18th century. A 32-pounder fired a cast-iron ball weighing approximately 14.5 kilograms. It had an effective range of roughly 400 meters, and at point-blank range it could penetrate any wooden hull afloat. Each gun crew consisted of between 10 and 14 men, performing a precisely choreographed sequence of operations. Clear the barrel, load the powder cartridge, ram the wadding, load the ball, prime the touch hole, aim, fire, sponge out the barrel to extinguish any sparks, repeat. A well-trained crew could complete this cycle in 90 seconds. In a fleet action involving dozens of ships all firing simultaneously, the noise alone was described by survivors as being physically painful, a pressure wave that could rupture eardrums at close range. Move up to the middle gun deck, the 24-pounders. Same principle, slightly lighter ball, slightly faster rate of fire because the smaller crews could move more quickly. The middle deck was responsible for what naval tacticians called the long-range engagement, softening the enemy from distance before the heavy guns of the lower deck finished the job. The upper gun deck carried 12-pounders and 9-pounders, still heavier than anything on a typical pirate ship. But the upper deck's role was not purely about weight of metal, it was about flexibility. The upper guns could be elevated and depressed more easily than the massive pieces below, making them useful for firing at rigging, at the decks of enemy ships, at targets that required precision rather than brute force. Above the upper gun deck, the quarterdeck and the forecastle, carrying carronades, short-barreled guns that sacrificed range for an enormous bore diameter. A carronade could fire grape shot, bags containing dozens of iron balls across the deck of an enemy ship at close range with catastrophic effect on any living thing caught in the path of the discharge. A grape shot volley from the Swallow's forward guns, not a dramatic single cannon shot. A cloud of iron moving at killing speed across a specific deck at a specific moment. The crew organization matched the armament in its sophistication. The 800 men of a first rate were divided into specialized divisions, each with a clearly defined role in every tactical scenario. The gun crews, organized by deck and gun number. The sail trimmers, whose job was to maintain the ship's speed and heading regardless of what the guns were doing. The marines, soldiers rather than sailors, whose role was to fire muskets from elevated positions and to lead or repel boarding actions. There was a carpenter and his crew, whose job during battle was to move continuously through the ship, identifying shot holes and plugging them before they could flood a compartment. There was a surgeon and his mates working in the cockpit below the waterline, the only relatively safe space during a gun action, performing amputations and treating wounds by lantern light, while the deck above them shook with each broadside. Every man had a battle station. Every battle station had a backup. The system was designed to keep functioning even as men died, which they did, in every significant action. The Royal Navy of 1720 was not a democracy. It was, in many ways, the most hierarchical institution in the British Empire. Officers were absolute authorities. Common sailors had almost no rights. The conditions below decks were brutal by any modern standard, and by the standards of the era, they were not much better. But the hierarchy produced competence, the discipline produced coordination, and the coordination produced a fighting effectiveness that no pirate crew, however brave or skilled individually, could match collectively. Here is the irony that most histories of the golden age of piracy managed to avoid. The navy that hunted the pirates down was built, commanded, and crewed in large part by men who had learned everything they knew from privateering, from legalized piracy. The institutional knowledge that made the Royal Navy so effective against the pirates of the 1720s was knowledge that had been developed by operating exactly as those pirates operated, just with a letter of marque in the captain's pocket. Woodes Rogers, the man who destroyed Nassau as a pirate base, had made his fortune as a privateer. He had circumnavigated the globe in a privateering expedition. He had rescued Alexander Selkirk from his desert island, the man whose story became Robinson Crusoe. He understood the pirate world from the inside because he had been part of it. The officers who planned the anti-piracy campaigns of the 1720s had served in Queen Anne's War, when the distinction between privateer and pirate had been in practice essentially administrative. They knew the tactics, they knew the geography, they knew how pirate captains thought because they had thought that way themselves. The golden age of piracy was created by the British government's decision to commission privateers during Queen Anne's War, and then abruptly terminate those commissions when the war ended. The men who became the great pirates of the 1720s had, almost universally, been privateers first. They had been trained and equipped and sent to sea by the same imperial system that later hunted them down. Blackbeard had been a privateer. Hornigold had been a privateer. Samuel Bellamy, Calico Jack Rackham, Charles Vane, the core figures of the Golden Age, had all operated within the legal framework of privateering before the Treaty of Utrecht removed that framework. The British government had, in a very direct sense, built the pirates themselves, and then it built the machines to destroy them. The man of war was not just a weapon against the pirates. It was the Empire's way of erasing the evidence of its own contradictions. The privateers had been useful, now they were inconvenient. The first-rate ship of the line was the instrument through which inconvenient men were removed from the historical record. The last first-rate ship of the line to see active combat service was HMS Victoria, which fought at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, 80 years after the golden age of piracy had ended. By then, the ship's role was already changing, the technology beginning to shift toward the steam-powered ironclads that would make wooden warships obsolete within another generation. But what the man of war established during the golden age of piracy was not a type of ship. It was a principle, the principle of command of the sea. Command of the sea means that a major naval power, a state that invests in building and maintaining a sufficiently powerful ocean-going fleet, can prevent any non-state actor from using the ocean as a space outside state control. The pirates of the Golden Age had briefly, brilliantly, exploited a gap in that control. The man of war closed the gap. It has never been reopened. After 1730, the Caribbean was never again a space where pirates could operate at the scale that Blackbeard and Roberts operated. The specific combination of conditions that created the Golden Age the post-war surplus of skilled sailors, the weak colonial governance, the insufficient naval patrol presence, the port economies that tolerated pirate trade, those conditions were never recreated. The man of war did not just kill individual pirates. It killed the possibility of the world those pirates had built. There is something worth sitting with in that fact. The pirates of the Golden Age had built in the space that the Empire's contradictions had accidentally created, something genuinely extraordinary. They had written constitutions when most of the world was governed by divine right. They had practiced democracy when kings ruled absolutely. They had created disability insurance and workers' rights and checks on executive power that the civilized world would not adopt for another century or more. And it was all destroyed, not by superior ideas, not by the force of argument or the weight of evidence, by 2,000 tons of seasoned English oak and 110 cannons. The man of war did not win the argument. It ended it. That is both its triumph and its legacy. Charles Vane ran in 1720 and survived for a while. He was eventually arrested after being shipwrecked in the Bay of Honduras, tried in Jamaica, and hanged at Gallows Point in Port Royal in March of 1721. Not killed by a man of war in open battle, arrested, tried, hanged, the Empire had become efficient enough that it no longer always needed to sink the pirates. Sometimes it just waited for them to be somewhere catchable. The man of war had changed the calculations so completely that even pirates who escaped direct naval combat died eventually in the world the warships had created. A world with fewer places to hide, fewer ports to sell in, fewer men willing to join a crew when the odds had shifted so decisively against survival. Bartholomew Roberts understood this in his final years. He was no longer just a pirate. He was a man fighting a rearguard action against the closing of a world. His code became stricter because he needed men he could trust completely. His operations moved to West Africa because the Caribbean had become too dangerous. He was still brilliant. He was still successful. He was also running out of ocean. The fog clears, and there it is. 5 decks of gun ports, 3 masts touching the clouds, 800 trained men waiting quietly for the order to fire. Not just a ship, a statement. A statement that the ocean belongs to the Empire, that the spaces outside state control are temporary, that the world the pirates built, however extraordinary, however unjust its erasure, was always going to end when the Empire decided it was time. The next time you see a pirate flag, remember what haunted it. The shadow on the horizon, the floating fortress, the ship that didn't just fight the pirates, the ship that ended the world they had built. If you want to go deeper, the specific battles, the specific ships, the specific men on both sides, I have a full series in development on the naval campaigns that ended the Golden Age. Drop your questions in the comments. Tell me which captain you want covered next. Thanks for sailing with Rogue Bilge.